That they would, of course, all be funded in the main by his sponsorship.
Obviously, at that point, things were getting a little bit out of hand, and he must have, at that point, been trying to figure out how he was going to pull it off.
Brian had told probably one too many lies to Amal. He then had to find a way of making that happen.
I think this goes to the development of his fantasy life, and what is interesting about him is it seemed to be a pretty rapid escalation in terms of his fantasies. He's getting more and more detached from the reality of his life and true situation, and so that within a relatively short time he's into a situation where he's going to do anything he can to avoid detection, people finding out what he's doing, but of course his parents see through it very easily because he's totally dependent on them.
Brian Blackwell desperately needed money to fund the luxury trip he'd promised Amal, but his parents were about to put a stop to his extravagant spending. On Sunday, July the 25th, 2004, things were about to come to a head between Brian and his parents. It began with a trip Brian and his father made to the tennis club that afternoon.
A number of witnesses who were present that Sunday afternoon, those witnesses are probably the last persons ever to see Brian Blackwell Sr. alive again. Records demonstrate that sometime after 11 o'clock on that Sunday morning, he booked 2 tickets from Manchester to New York, to JFK Airport. Those tickets were for himself and Amal. They were particularly expensive tickets. I think they were business class. Certainly the cost of those was between £4,000 and £5,000, a sum of money that Brian Blackwell simply did not have access to, but a sum of money that could easily be met on his father's credit card. And in fact, that was how those flights were paid for.
His parents find out about it, and they find out that Brian's promised this holiday to Amal and put the foot down and say that he's not going to go. Now, this is a great challenge to Brian, because up until this point, everything that Brian's been able to say to Amal, he's been able to deliver on. He said, "I'll buy you a car," and he bought her a car. It arrived on the doorstep. He said he'd buy Amal a diamond ring, and she got a ring even though it wasn't diamond. So all the fantasies that Brian had lived out up until this point hadn't been challenged. When we're left in a situation where his parents challenge his authority or his ability to go to America, how's he going to get out of the situation? There's a great loss of face or a loss of self-esteem. He's embarrassed.
It's very difficult to be accurate as to precisely what took place that fateful early evening, because the only person still alive who can tell us what happened is Brian Blackwell, and he is such a practiced liar and deceiver that very little store can be set by what he said. I suspect probably what must have happened is that he reached the point of no return with his parents. They were onto his spending. They'd clearly been roused in the past about his spending, and Brian must have been pushed into a corner in his own mind, and at that stage matters took the most dreadful turn. Thereafter, it's obvious that there was a row between Brian and his parents.
Brian Blackwell hit his 71-year-old father over the head with a claw hammer and stabbed him 30 times with a 10-inch carving knife. He then knocked his 61-year-old mother unconscious with the hammer before stabbing her in the head and chest around 20 times.
Having killed his parents, Brian later described burning the clothing that he'd been wearing in an incinerator in the garden. Amal was waiting for him to turn up at the house and had actually rung him on a couple of occasions, and a taxi had called outside the long driveway, which he hadn't come out to, so she then arranged for another taxi, and he left.
In fact, at one point, he pretended to go back into the house to say goodbye, in the full knowledge that he'd left the body of his parents there. He then went to Amal's house, and it was noticeable that in the course of the journey from Melling to Amal's house, the taxi driver didn't detect any signs of the traumatic event to which Brian had recently been involved. In fact, he said it was a perfectly normal conversation, which is a rather surprising feature and a rather chilling feature.
The following day, they flew to New York. They flew business class for tickets just under £5,000. They stayed at one of the better hotels in New York. and then flew on to Miami and Barbados and had a very expensive holiday. It was clear now that money was no object to Brian. It seems almost beyond belief that any person, particularly a person who is only fairly young and not that worldly wise, could put aside the events that he'd left back at home, which were horrific, and be able to separate them from his holiday. It takes a certain sort of person, I think, that is able to do that. And it was certainly something he was able to achieve, to the extent that Amal had no idea whatsoever that he was carrying this, what anybody else would describe as a huge burden on himself.
When Brian Blackwell and Amal Saba landed in New York, Brian had arranged for a limousine to meet them and take them to one of the city's most luxurious hotels, the Plaza. He booked one of its top suites overlooking Central Park. All the time, Amal was completely unaware of the horrific crime Brian had committed. In this chilling video clip, Brian is clearly seen to be having a great time with Amal, enjoying the luxury surroundings just days after killing his parents.
Let's show you the bathroom with our own little television, shower,
And jacuzzi.
and we have our own little dressing table. That's me, hello.
And that's me.
And this is our view at night. Don't know if you can see anything.
Here she was in this, it's like an apartment. It's the presidential suite. It's where Kennedy stays and Bush stays. And Brian then ordered a meal of lobster and oysters and caviar. So it must have been very romantic. And he said that she could go to Prada or Gucci or wherever she wanted in Fifth Avenue in the morning and buy whatever she wanted.
They stayed in very top hotels, hundreds of pounds a night. They ate and drank lavishly, the finest champagne, lobsters. We actually recovered a bill from one of the hotels that was an extremely expensive dinner. There was absolutely no expense spared on this trip, and certainly Amal must have been dazzled by the ability that this young man had to spend money.